They came without warning, without mercy, without hesitation. The year was 2031 when the first alien ships broke through Earth's atmosphere like gods descending from heaven. Their vessels were enormous, black as the void, each one the size of a small city. Humanity had dreamed of first contact for centuries, written stories, made movies, built radio telescopes, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared us for this. The Vreth were not curious explorers or peaceful visitors searching for knowledge. They were conquerors, ancient and calculating, who had swallowed 1,000 worlds before ours. Their technology was so far beyond ours that our militaries crumbled within 72 hours. Nuclear weapons were swatted from the sky like insects. Fighter jets dissolved in beams of pale blue light before they could even close to firing range. Every attempt at resistance was met with calm, almost bored efficiency. Within a week, humanity had surrendered. Within a month, the restructuring had begun. The Vreth divided Earth into administrative zones, each managed by a different alien faction within their empire. Humans were classified, cataloged, and assigned roles based on Vreth assessments of our usefulness. Scientists became data processors. Soldiers became labor units. Teachers became silence. They dismantled every human government. They burned no cities, killed no masses, but they strangled something deeper inside us. They dismantled our freedom, our agency, our belief that we mattered in the universe. The Vreth called us useful primitives, a species barely above animals, but trainable enough to serve. And so the darkness settled over humanity. For many, it felt permanent, total, absolute. But deep in the hearts of a few scattered humans, something ancient stirred. Something that the Vreth had not calculated for. Something that no algorithm in their vast empire could fully model. The human capacity for stubborn, irrational, burning hope. If you're watching this and feeling that same fire, smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this story. Share this with someone who needs to remember what humanity is truly made of. It started small, as all great rebellions do. A mining engineer named Yusuf Adebayo, working the cobalt fields of what used to be the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet-spoken, with hands roughened by a decade of underground work. The Vreth had assigned him Zone 7, labor classification Delta, productivity rank acceptable. To them he was a number, a resource unit, a thing that carried minerals from one place to another. But Yusuf had a mind that never stopped turning, even underground, even in the dark. He noticed things the Vreth did not expect him to notice. He noticed that the alien overseers changed shift rotations every 11 Earth days. He noticed that their scanning frequencies cycled in a predictable pattern with a 3-minute gap at dawn. He noticed that the labor tunnels connected through abandoned shafts the Vreth had never bothered to map to communication relay stations. Old human infrastructure, deemed too primitive to be worth cataloging by the conquerors. And Yusuf had one more thing the Vreth had not accounted for. A childhood friend named Priya Chandrasekharan, now assigned to a data processing facility in what had been Mumbai. Priya had been a network engineer before the occupation. More importantly, she remembered every protocol, every handshake, every backdoor in the old human satellite communication grid. The Vreth had overlaid their own communications network on top of it. They had not deleted the human one. They simply assumed no human would have the knowledge or the audacity to use it. They were wrong about both. Yusuf's first message to Priya was 23 characters long, encoded in a compression algorithm they had invented together as teenagers playing at being spies. It read, "The tunnels still breathe. Are you there?" 3 days passed. Then, through the noise of a Vreth data processing report, buried in error correction packets, came 11 characters. "I am here. Always." That was the beginning. Not with a battle cry, not with explosions, not with speeches that shook the heavens. With 23 characters in the dark, with 2 people refusing to disappear. Over the next 6 months, Yusuf and Priya built something they called the thread line. It was not a network in any conventional sense. It was a series of layered, fragmented communications hidden inside the waste data of Vreth administrative systems. Priya had discovered that the Vreth rarely audited their own error logs. Every massive computational system generates noise, and theirs was no different. She learned to write messages that looked exactly like noise. Yusef learned to move through the tunnel systems without triggering the motion sensors, mapping safe routes and marking them with a code only another human trained by them would recognize. By the end of year 1, they had connected 43 people across 6 zones: teachers, engineers, doctors, farmers, a former general who now shoveled BioWest, and a 14-year-old girl named Asha, who turned out to be the most gifted cryptographer any of them had ever encountered. They called themselves the Threadline, and they did not yet dare to speak of rebellion. They only dared to speak of memory. "Remember who we are," Yusef said in one of his earliest broadcasts. "They want us to forget. Forgetting is the first death. Do not give them that." Year 2 brought the first expansion beyond Earth. This sounds impossible, and it nearly was, but humanity had not been the only species conquered by the Vreth. Far from it. Among the labor forces brought to Earth to supplement human workers were members of a species called the tall, gray-skinned, four-armed, with enormous eyes, adapted to low-light environments. The Kailan had been subjugated 90 years before humanity. Most humans feared them or avoided them. The Vreth encouraged this, seeding distrust between slave species as policy. But Yusef was not most humans. He watched a Kailan laborer named Seth work for 3 weeks before approaching him. He did it in the tunnel, during the 3-minute sensor gap at dawn, with nothing but a hand gesture and a shared glance. What he offered Seth was not rebellion. Not yet. He offered something simpler. Information. He showed Seth a map of the sensor gaps. In return, Seth showed Yusef something that changed everything. A small, flat device, no larger than a fingernail, woven into the fabric of his sleeve. A Kailan communication node, 90 years old, still functioning, still connected to a scattered network of Kailan survivors across 3 star systems. The Vreth had never found it. Because, Seth explained in broken human trade language, the Vreth do not believe small things can be dangerous. They think too big. We have always been small. That sentence became the motto of what would eventually become the most consequential alliance in galactic history. They think too big. We have always been small. If that hit you right in the chest, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel and share this story, because we are just getting started. Year 4. The Threadline had grown to over 2,000 people across 12 zones on Earth, and through Seath's network, had made contact with Kailan remnants in 3 other star systems. But it was in year 4 that they found the third piece of the puzzle. The Dorak. If the Kailan were survivors by stealth, the Dorak were survivors by sheer biological stubbornness. Squat, dense-boned, with a metabolism that could slow to near hibernation under stress, the Dorak had been conquered by the Vreth 140 years ago. They had been nearly exterminated in a campaign so brutal that even other Vreth-conquered species spoke of it in whispered horror. But nearly was not completely. A remnant population of perhaps 3,000 Dorak survived scattered across the fringes of Vreth territory. They had no fleet, no weapons, no infrastructure. What they had was something far more valuable. They had 200 years of accumulated intelligence on Vreth military systems, patrol routes, fleet compositions, command hierarchies, supply chains, the location of critical relay stations, the precise frequencies used for Imperial communications, and, most importantly, the 17 known structural weaknesses in Vreth warship hull design. The Dorak elder who first made contact with Priya through Seath's network was named Garak. She was, by her own reckoning, 212 years old. She had been gathering this information since before humanity had landed on its own moon. When Priya asked why she had never tried to act on it, Garak's answer was patient and sad. "Because I had no one to act with," she said. "You cannot topple an empire alone. You need people with nothing left to lose who still choose to fight. I have been waiting. I did not know I was waiting for humans. But here you are." Year 7 brought the first true test. The Vreth had begun to notice anomalies, not in the Threadline, which remained hidden, but in productivity patterns. Humans were doing something subtle, something the Vreth had never seen in a conquered species. They were coordinating slowdowns, not strikes. Nothing so obvious, Just the most mathematically precise series of minor inefficiencies ever engineered into a labor system. Priya had designed it. She called it the drift. Across 20 different zones, human workers began producing at exactly 97.3% efficiency. Not enough to trigger punishment protocols, which activated at 90%, but consistent enough that over 3 years, the cumulative output difference added up to something staggering. Enough to delay the construction of a new Vreth processing facility by 19 months. The Vreth knew something was wrong. They began auditing human productivity algorithms. They brought in their own analysts. And here is where the direct intelligence proved its worth for the first time. Garak had in her files the complete personnel hierarchy of the Vreth Efficiency Bureau. She knew which analyst would be assigned to Earth. She knew his behavioral patterns, his blind spots, his known preference for attributing anomalies to environmental factors rather than coordinated action. He had made the same mistake on 4 other worlds. Priya designed the drift specifically to look like environmental degradation. When the analyst arrived, he found exactly what he expected to find. A nutrient deficiency in the food allocation system causing a minor reduction in human metabolic output. He filed his report. The facility delay stood. It was not a victory of weapons. It was a victory of information, patience, and the deeply human art of making someone see what they already believed. Year 12. Yusuf was 46 now, grayer, slower moving, but with eyes that had grown sharper with every passing year. He had never stopped expanding the thread line, and now it numbered over 40,000 humans across every zone on Earth, plus off-world contacts with the Kalan network, the Dorak remnants, and 2 newly discovered species. The Merrick, silicon-based organisms, who communicated through magnetic field modulation, conquered 300 years ago, who had spent those centuries building a library of Vreth legal and administrative codes, so comprehensive it made Garak's military files look modest. And the Ven, a species of collective consciousness, distributed across a gas giant, who had never been conquered, only blockaded, isolated, studied, and slowly starved of the resources they needed to expand. The Vin were angry. They had been angry for a very long time, and they had capabilities that the Vreth had never fully mapped. Together, these 5 species, human, Kalan, Dorak, Merak, and Ven, formed what Yusuf named the Long Thread Coalition, named for the thread line that had started it all, named for the idea that a single thread, long enough, patient enough, woven carefully enough through the fabric of an empire, could eventually unravel it entirely. The coalition did not declare war, not yet. Not for many more years. What they did was something more dangerous than war. They learned. They shared every piece of intelligence each species had gathered. They mapped the Vreth Empire completely for the first time in any conquered species history. 712 star systems. 300 worlds. A military fleet of 17,000 capital ships and uncountable smaller vessels. An administrative bureaucracy so vast it had become its own kind of weakness. If this story is pulling you in, please like and subscribe right now. Share it with someone who loves a story about the underdog rising. We have a long way still to go, year 19. Asha, the 14-year-old cryptographer from year 1, was now 33. She had spent the last decade not just encoding messages, but doing something no one had asked her to do and no one had thought was possible. She had been reverse engineering the Vreth command language. Not their spoken language, which was known. Their computational language, the deep structure code underlying every Vreth system. From door locks to warship navigation, to the Imperial Treasury. It had taken her 11 years. She had done it with nothing but pattern analysis, stolen processing cycles from Vreth, administrative computers, and the kind of obsessive focus that the Vreth classification system had labeled in her file as abnormal fixation, productivity neutral. They had categorized her gift as a harmless quirk. Asha called her work the key. Wheat decay. A sufficiently skilled operator could, in theory, issue commands to any Vreth computational system as if they were an authorized Vreth administrator. Not break in, not hack. Walk through the front door. When Asha presented the key to the Long Thread Coalition Council, there was a long silence. Then, Seth, who had spent 19 years watching humans carefully and had developed a deep respect that sometimes felt like awe, said what everyone was thinking. "You built a lockpick for an empire." Asha smiled. "I built a master key," she said. "There is a difference." Year 24. The first off-world operation. A Vreth supply depot in the Kalen home system had been identified by Gurak's files as a critical node in the fleet resupply chain for the Empire's eastern arm. Not the most important node. Not something whose loss would cripple the Empire, but something whose loss would create a very specific cascade of delays, rerouting of resources, and reallocation of patrol vessels. The Priya had modeled to open a small but navigable window in the blockade around the Ven gas giant. The Ven needed 17 days of unobstructed access to 3 specific asteroid clusters to harvest enough raw material to build what they had been designing in secret for over a century. What the Ven were building was not a weapon. It was a network of mass relay nodes that, once activated, could allow the Long Thread Coalition to communicate across the entire Empire simultaneously, bypassing Vreth communications infrastructure entirely. The operation to destroy the depot required 6 people. 2 humans, 1 Kellen, 1 Durak, and 2 Marak. In their physical support shells, it also required us as key, used for the first time in the field, to issue a false resupply order that moved the depot's security force to the far side of the installation for precisely 40 minutes. The team was led by a human named Tomas Ferreira, former Brazilian Special Forces, now labor classification Epsilon in a mining zone on the Kalen homeworld. Having been transported there 7 years earlier when the Vreth reshuffled labor pools, he had found the thread line through Seath's network. He had been waiting for exactly this kind of mission ever since. The depot was destroyed. The patrol rerouting happened exactly as Priya had modeled. The Ven had their 17 days. The mass relay network was built. The Coalition had just given itself a voice that spanned the stars, and the Vreth had no idea any of it was connected. Yet, the Coalition had grown. 3 more species had been brought in. The operations had grown more complex, more precise, more damaging to the Empire's operational efficiency. None were dramatic. None made the Vreth launch a search and destroy response. Each was a thread pulled carefully, deliberately, from the vast tapestry of Imperial control. A Vreth governor on one world received falsified intelligence about a rival, triggering a bureaucratic war that consumed years and massive administrative resources. A critical mineral processing plant was fed subtle data errors that caused it to produce structural components 0.3% below specification, causing a new class of warships to develop microfractures in their hull plating after 18 months of service. A medical supply chain was quietly rerouted, so that Vreth military doctors in one sector received the wrong pharmaceutical compounds. Not lethally wrong, just wrong enough to reduce their effective treatment rates by 12%, degrading troop health over time. And through it all, the Marek's library of administrative codes allowed the Coalition to create paper trails that pointed blame always at other never at any conquered species. The Empire was being made to fight itself. Slowly. Precisely. Invisibly. And every year, the Coalition grew stronger, more coordinated, more capable. In year 31, the Council met for the first time as a full body. Not in person, which was still impossible, but through the Ven Relay network, which allowed real-time communication across star systems, with a fidelity that felt, to the humans involved, almost like sitting in the same room. Yusuf, now 61. "We have been at this for 31 years, he said. "We have done extraordinary things with patience and shadow. But I think we all feel it. We are approaching the moment when shadow will not be enough. The moment when we must step into the light." "Not yet," he added quickly, "but we must begin preparing for that moment. As if it is inevitable, because it is." The Council agreed. They began what Priya called the long draw. The systematic, multi-decade process of building everything the Coalition would need for open conflict. Not just military capacity, which they were decades from having, but every other form of power, economic disruption, political fracture within the Empire, alliance with every conquered or blockaded species they could reach, The creation of a unified command structure capable of coordinating action across dozens of species and hundreds of worlds. The cultivation of sympathizers within the Vreth Empire itself. Because here is something the Vreth had never anticipated. Not every Vreth approved of the Empire. Subscribe right now if you want to follow this. All the way to the end. Like this video if you believe in what these species were building together. Share it because the next part is where everything changes. His name was Vreth, Admiralty Coordinator Sothel, and he was having a crisis of conscience. Not because he was kind or gentle. Sothel was, by most measures, exactly the kind of calculating, ambitious Vreth administrator the Empire produced by the thousands. But he was also, in the specific parlance of the Vreth academic class, a historical materialist. He believed the Empire's long-term stability depended on a rational utilization of all available resources, and over decades of reviewing productivity data from conquered worlds, he had come to a conclusion that deeply disturbed him. The Empire was systematically underutilizing its subject species, not because the species lacked capability, which is what every other Vreth administrator assumed, but because the Empire's method of subjugation was destroying that capability over time. Sothel had written 3 internal papers on this subject. All 3 had been suppressed. He had been quietly demoted twice. And now, at the age of what humans would call 70, he sat in a minor administrative post, reviewing mineral extraction reports from Zone 7 on Earth, and staring at the ghost of a productivity anomaly that he was absolutely certain was not environmental in origin. He did not report it. Instead, he submitted a requisition for 3 months of independent audit access to Zone 7 records, which the Coalition's watchers inside the Records Division flagged immediately. The debate that followed in the Coalition Council was intense and lasted 9 days. Some argued Sothel should be removed, his audit access blocked, his investigation derailed. Yusuf argued the opposite. "He is looking for what we are doing," Yusuf said, but he suppressed it 3 times already when he found uncomfortable truths. He is not a hunter. He is a man trapped in a system he can see as wrong. That is the most dangerous thing an empire can produce. More dangerous than any soldier. More dangerous than any weapon. A believer in the empire who has stopped believing. Yusuf proposed that he contact Sothel directly. The council thought he had finally lost his mind. He convinced them, anyway. The contact was made through the most improbable channel imaginable, buried inside an official productivity report that Sothel was reviewing. Preya placed a message. It was not in any human language. It was written in the formal notation of Vreth historical materialism, the academic discipline Sothel had dedicated his career to. It presented in 6 precise paragraphs the evidence that the productivity anomaly he was investigating was not only real but intentional, and that it was the visible surface of something that had been operating for 47 years across the entire empire. It concluded with a single sentence. "We have been waiting for someone on your side who could see us. Now that you can, the question is, what will you do with what you know?" Sothel filed his audit report. It described a nutrient deficiency in the food allocation system, and then Sothel quietly requested a posting transfer to a position that the Merek's administrative library confirmed, gave him access to Imperial Fleet movement records. Year 53. Yusuf had a bio, died quietly in his sleep in Zone 7. At the age of 7, he had not slowed down until his body simply would not carry him anymore. In his final year, he had been feeding intelligence to Sothel, receiving fleet data in return, and continuing to expand the thread line, which by then numbered over 4 million human contacts across Earth and Vreth-held space. His funeral was a work shift. The Vreth did not observe human death rites, but 40,000 people in Zone 7 found reasons to pause for exactly 3 minutes at the hour he died. They did not gather. They did not speak. They just stopped, and were still, and remembered. Preya sent a message through the network that reached every Coalition contact across all species. "Thread 1 is ended," it read. "All threads continue. Leadership of the human element passed to Asha, now 42, and to Tomas, now who had spent the intervening years building the Coalition's nascent, covert operations capacity into something that resembled, by its small-scale effectiveness, a special forces unit distributed across dozens of worlds. They were very different leaders from Yusuf. Asha worked in code and abstraction, seeing the Empire as a computational system to be exploited. Tamaz worked in bodies and terrain, seeing it as a physical problem to be solved by precise application of force at precise locations. Together they formed something Yusuf had always hoped to create, a leadership that could think in both dimensions simultaneously. The Long-Thread Coalition now encompassed 31 species. It had been operating continuously for 71 years. 3 generations of humans had been born into it, and something remarkable was happening. The humans who had grown up entirely inside the coalition were different from their parents and grandparents in ways that were hard to articulate but unmistakable. They had never known freedom. They had never lived in a world not governed by an alien empire. They had grown up speaking the coalition's shared communication language alongside their native tongues. They had grown up with Kalen and Doric and Marek and Ven as simply the other people in their world. They did not hate the Vreth in the way the older generations sometimes did, with a personal, burning fury born from the memory of what had been taken. They hated the Empire with something colder and more strategic. They saw it not as a wound to be avenged, but as an obstacle to be removed. And they were very good at removing obstacles. The Coalition's operations had, by year 71, degraded Vreth Imperial efficiency by a calculated 23%. Not enough for the Empire to feel critically threatened. Enough for it to be perpetually, exhaustingly stressed. Administrative crises that never quite resolved. Supply chains that functioned but always at less than optimal capacity. Military units that were always just slightly under strength, under-equipped, under-rested. Political factions within the Empire that fought each other with an intensity that now an old man but still feeding intelligence through his successors, confirmed had been carefully stoked by coalition operations for decades. The Empire was tired. It did not know why. It did not know what was doing this to it. It just felt, in every calculation, in every resource allocation, in every strategic projection, a creeping sense that something was not adding up. Smash that like button if you can feel where this is going. Subscribe because the endgame is coming and you will not want to miss it. Share this with everyone you know. Year 103. The Coalition made its first major military acquisition. Not through battle, through the Vreth Empire's own administrative system. Over 3 years, using Usha's key and the deep administrative access provided by 4 generations of Maricode analysis, the Coalition had been quietly manipulating the decommissioning and salvage processing of outdated Vreth warships. Ships marked for disassembly were instead routed to processing facilities where the disassembly teams were coalition-aligned. The ships were taken apart on paper. In reality, the components were cataloged, hidden, and in some cases reassembled at remote locations that Dorak navigational expertise had identified as places the Vreth fleet never patrolled. It took 31 years to accumulate enough components to assemble 47 functional warships. 47 was not a fleet against 17,000 Vreth capital ships. It was not even a gesture, but it was a beginning. More importantly, it was proof that it could be done. And by year 103, the Ven had finished something they had been building for 60 years. Something they called the pressure wave. It was not a weapon of destruction. The Ven, in their collective consciousness, found the concept of destruction for its own sake philosophically repugnant. The pressure wave was a gravitational manipulation device, built inside their gas giant, capable of generating precise, localized gravitational anomalies at a distance. What this meant in practical terms was simple. Any Vreth warship or fleet within a calculable range could be made to feel the sudden, catastrophic effect of being in the wrong gravitational environment. Not destroyed, just rendered unable to maintain course, unable to fire accurately, unable to operate with any of the precision that made Vreth military doctrines so effective. The Ven had, in 60 years of quiet work, built the galaxy's most effective military disruptor, and the Vreth had spent those 60 years studying the gas giant, confident that a blockaded species could be no threat. Year 147. The Coalition had developed something else. Something no military analyst in the Vreth Empire would ever have predicted. Doctrine. Not just tactics or operational planning, a complete philosophy of warfare designed specifically to defeat a larger, more technologically advanced enemy. It was called Thread Doctrine, and it was, in essence, the systematic application of everything the Coalition had learned in 147 years of operating against the Empire. Thread Doctrine held that a superior force can be defeated if you deny it the ability to apply its superiority. Every Vreth military advantage assumed a specific operating environment. Large-scale fleet engagements in open space, overwhelming firepower against conventional military formations. Rapid forced projection enabled by predictable logistics. Thread Doctrine was designed to make all of these impossible. Instead of engaging the Vreth fleet, Coalition forces would operate in their logistical depth, destroying supply nodes, communication relays, and resupply routes. Instead of fixed formations, Coalition military units would be distributed, mobile, and fundamentally embedded in the population of every world they operated on. The Ven's pressure wave would deny fleet engagements by making any concentration of Vreth ships tactically unworkable. Usha's key would allow the Coalition to operate inside the Empire's own command systems, issuing orders that moved Vreth forces away from Coalition operations and toward phantom threats. And the Dorak Intelligence Archive, now supplemented by 147 years of new collection, gave the Coalition a picture of the Empire's operational state more accurate than anything the Empire's own strategic command possessed. The Coalition did not plan to defeat the Vreth in battle. It planned to make the Empire impossible to administer, to make every projection fail, every plan collapse, every response arrive too late and in the wrong place, to make the Empire feel, from the inside, like it was falling apart on its own, until the day it was, year 200. The 200th anniversary of humanity's conquest was observed, without the Vreth knowing it was observed, by every human in the Coalition. Usha's granddaughter, now the Coalition's chief cryptographic officer, sent a message through the Ven relay network. 200 years, she wrote. They thought they had ended us. They gave us the dark, and we made fire. They gave us chains, and we made tools. They gave us silence, and we learned to speak in 1,000 languages they cannot hear. We are not what they conquered. We are what that conquest forged, and we are not done yet. Like this, if those words reached you. Subscribe to follow every step of what comes next. Share this because this story belongs to everyone. Year 280. The long draw was complete. The Coalition had spent 238 years building every element of what was needed. A military force of 412 warships, assembled in secret from salvaged Vreth components, and new construction in hidden facilities across 11 star systems. A fleet doctrine designed to maximize effectiveness against a far larger enemy. A communications network the Empire could not intercept. An intelligence picture of unprecedented completeness. Political fractures within the Empire that had been carefully nurtured 4 generations and were now deep enough to be genuinely dangerous. Sothvel's successors, 5 generations of Vreth administrative dissidents, who had quietly built a faction within the Empire that was not sympathetic to the Coalition, not exactly, but deeply committed to the idea that the Empire's current path was suicidal, and a coalition of 31 species, 7 generations deep, who had learned to trust each other in the way that only people who have survived together in the dark can trust each other. Absolutely. Completely. Without reservation. The Long Thread Coalition Council met, not through the relay network this time, in person, for the first time in Coalition history, on an asteroid in an uninhabited system that the Dorak Archive confirmed had not been visited by a Vereth vessel in 60 years. Tomas's grandson now, the Coalition's military commander, stood before the assembled representatives of 31 species and said something simple. We are ready. Are we willing? The vote was unanimous. Year 289, day 1 of the Long Thread War. It did not begin with a battle. It began with a silence. At 0300 hours Imperial Standard Time, Usha's key was used simultaneously at 47 critical nodes in the Vreth Imperial Communication Network, not to destroy those nodes, to make them lie. Every communication flowing through those 47 nodes began to carry subtle, precisely calibrated errors. Not enough to be detected as tampering, enough to ensure that for the next 72 hours, every order, every report, Every fleet movement instruction passing through those nodes would arrive at its destination corrupted in a specific, targeted way. The Vreth Empire's Eastern Fleet received orders to redeploy 2 coordinates that did not exist. The Administrative Command for 7 occupied worlds received false reports of civil emergencies, requiring immediate military response. 3 fleet admirals received intelligence reports, perfectly formatted, perfectly authenticated, indicating that each of them was under investigation by the Imperial Security Directorate for treason, and 1 message, singular and precise, was delivered to every member of the Vreth Administrative Dissident faction simultaneously. It was not from the Coalition. It appeared to come from within the Empire's own highest command. It presented in the cold language of Imperial strategic assessment the conclusion that the Empire's current governing council had so thoroughly mismanaged Imperial resources that immediate reform was the only alternative to catastrophic collapse. It was entirely true. It was not what the governing council had written. While the Empire's attention was consumed by this cascade of manufactured crises, the Coalition moved. 412 warships emerged from null space at 40 different points simultaneously. Not near Veth fleet concentrations, near logistics nodes, supply depots, communication relays, and processing facilities. Each strike was precise, fast, and designed to be over before the Vreth could respond effectively. Each struck at a node whose loss had been calculated to cascade into a specific operational failure deeper in the Empire. The Vreth responded with the overwhelming force of a 17,000-ship fleet, and found that no matter how many ships they concentrated, the pressure wave made fleet concentration impossible to sustain. Every time more than 30 Vreth ships gathered in one place, they became unable to maintain formation, unable to fire accurately, unable to do anything except fights to maintain basic ship function. The Empire had never encountered this. Every tactical manual they had ever written assumed they could bring overwhelming force to bear. The Ven had spent 60 years making sure they could not. The first week of the Longthread War saw the Coalition lose 11 warships and destroy 800 Vreth vessels. Not because the Coalition was stronger, because the Coalition had spent 289 years making. Sure, the Vreth could not fight the way they knew how to fight. Year 291, 2 years of war. The Coalition had lost 63 warships. The Vreth had lost over 4,000. The Empire was not collapsing. It was enormous, resilient, and deeply stubborn. But it was bleeding in ways it did not understand and could not stop. And internally, the cracks that the Coalition had been widening for generations were becoming fractures. The administrative dissident faction had gone from a quiet minority to a loud and growing political force. 3 Outer Rim systems had declared autonomy. The Empire was fighting a military enemy it could barely find and an internal political crisis it could barely manage simultaneously. The Vreth Governing Council, desperate and confused, did something that surprised even the Coalition. They requested a communication channel, not a negotiation. Just a channel. To whoever is doing this, the message read, "We wish to understand what you want." Usha's granddaughter, now called simply the Keykeeper, composed the response. She sent it through the Empire's own communication system, authenticated by the Imperial codes that no one in the Empire knew the Coalition possessed. "You know what we want," she wrote. "You have always known. You came to our worlds, all of our worlds, and you took something from us that was not yours to take. We want it back. All of it. Every world, every species. Every right you took when you decided we were things instead of people. We are not asking. We have never been asking. We have been building. For 291 years, we have been building toward this moment. And what you are experiencing right now is not the full weight of what we built. It is the warning. If you want to know what comes after the warning, give us the wrong answer." The Governing Council deliberated for 30 days. The Coalition continued operations throughout. If you need to pause and breathe after that, take a moment and hit like before you do. Subscribe so you are here when this concludes. Share because the world needs to hear this story. Year 293. The Vreth Governing Council fractured. 3 members sided with the Reform faction, arguing the Empire could not sustain a war against an enemy that had demonstrably been operating inside it for nearly 3 centuries. 2 members argued for escalation, for using weapons the Empire had never used in its history. planet-destroying weapons held in reserve for existential threats. One member, an elderly administrator who had served the council for 40 years, stood up in their final session and said what the Keykeeper had written about the warning. She read it aloud. Then she said, "I have reviewed the operational data for the past 2 years. I have reviewed the economic disruption data for the past 200 years. This coalition has been inside our empire for longer than most human civilizations last. They did not destroy us when they could have created more damage than they did. They disrupted They degraded. They fractured, but they chose consistently to strike at function rather than lives. This is not the behavior of an enemy that wants to destroy us. This is the behavior of an enemy that wants to survive. And after everything we did to them, after everything we took from every species they represent, the fact that survival is still their primary objective rather than our extinction should tell us something profound about who they are, and something profound about who we have been." The vote on escalation failed. The vote on opening formal negotiations passed. Year 297. The Long-Thread Accord negotiations had taken 4 years. The coalition had refused to negotiate from weakness. Operations had continued throughout, ensuring the Empire remained aware at every moment that the coalition's offer of a settled peace was genuinely preferable to the alternative. The Accord was the largest and most complex treaty in galactic history. Full sovereignty restored to all 31 coalition species. Their worlds returned, reparations to be paid over 200 years from Imperial resources, a permanent prohibition on the Vreth Empire, expanding into any system inhabited by a sentient species, an international body. The Long-Thread Council, with enforcement authority backed by the Vents pressure wave and the Coalition fleet, and one more provision placed at the insistence of Ushar's granddaughter. The Vreth Empire was required to formally acknowledge, in every official historical record and every educational curriculum, what it had done, not as political statement, as fact. "You will remember what you were," the Keykeeper said when presenting this provision, because only species that remember what they were capable of can be trusted to be something better. Year 470. The last surviving human who remembered the occupation died at the age of 109. Her name was Sira. She was Yusuf's great-great-granddaughter. She had been born 3 years before the Long-Thread Accord and had lived her entire adult life on a free Earth. She had spent those years as a historian, documenting the Coalition's story, ensuring the full account was preserved in every language of every species that had fought in it. In her final public speech, given at the opening of the Long-Thread Memorial on Earth, Sis sighed tease. "My ancestors started with 23 characters in the dark." He did not know if anyone would answer. He did not know if it would matter. He only knew that choosing silence was choosing to disappear. And humans, all the species who became family in that darkness, we are not a species that disappears. We are a species that finds each other in the dark. We are a species that makes fire where there was none. We are a species that takes 470 years, if that is what it takes. And we are a species that, when we finally step into the light, we bring everyone we found in the dark with us. Every species, every voice, every thread, because we never fought for just ourselves. We fought for the idea that no living thing should be classified as a resource, that no species should have its history erased, that no mind in this universe should be told it is too small to matter. We fought because we chose to, not because we were powerful, not because victory was guaranteed. Not because anyone said it was possible. We fought because somewhere in the long human story, in every culture, in every language, across every generation that ever lived on our small blue world, we wrote the same sentence 1,000 different ways. And the sentence was this: we will not stop. Not while a single thread remains. Not while a single voice can still speak in the dark. Not while there is still something worth fighting for. And there is always something worth fighting for. If this story moved you, if it reached something deep, please like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Share this story with every person you know who needs to be reminded what human beings are capable of. Because the Vreth thought they conquered a species. What they actually did was compress a spring. For 470 years, they held it down, and then they let go. And the universe has not been the same since. This is the story of the Long Thread Coalition. This is the story of Yusef and Priya, and Asha and Seth, and Garak, and the Keykeeper and Sira. This is the story of 23 characters in the dark. This is the story of what happens when you decide that the darkness is not the end. It is just a place where threads begin. But the story did not end with the Accord. No story this large ever ends cleanly, because empires do not simply fold themselves away like flags after a treaty is signed. They linger in the bones of the worlds they touched, in the systems they broke, in the generations they scarred, in the habits of fear that outlast the thing that caused the fear. The real work began after the war, and in many ways, it was harder than anything that came before it. Year 298, 1 year after the Long Thread Accord. The first human colony ships returned to Earth. There were millions of humans who had been transported off-world during the occupation. Labor reassignments, experimental programs, resource extraction deployments. All the cold machinery of imperial administration applied to human beings, as if they were inventory. Many of them had been off Earth for decades. Some had been born off Earth and had never seen it. They returned to a world that was free, but unrecognizable. The Vreth had not destroyed Earth's beauty, but they had rearranged its purpose entirely. Cities had become processing centers. Forests had become extraction zones. Oceans had been seeded with industrial organisms that had altered their chemistry in ways that would take generations to reverse. The Coalition's environmental scientists, a joint team of humans, and Americ subspecies that specialized in ecological systems, estimated full ecological restoration would take between 100 and 150 years. 150 years of patient, dedicated work to undo what the Empire had done in 260. The humans who came home wept. Not from despair, from recognition. This was still theirs. Broken and rearranged and scarred. Yes, but still theirs. And there was something in the human character. Something Yusef had named in his very first broadcast, and that 400 years of history had only confirmed. That meta thing that needed rebuilding and felt not defeat, but purpose. If that lands for you, like this video right now, subscribe so you're with us for every step of what comes next. Share this with someone who needs to remember that restoration is also a form of victory. Year 312. The Long Thread Council had been operating for 15 years. It was, to put it plainly, the most complicated governing body in galactic history. 31 species, each with their own culture, their own history, their own way of making decisions, their own wounds from the occupation, their own complicated relationship with the Vreth. Some species wanted the Vreth Empire dismantled entirely. Others argued that dismantling the Empire would create a power vacuum that would destabilize hundreds of worlds that currently depended on imperial administrative infrastructure. The Dorak, who had suffered the most catastrophically of any species, wanted justice that looked different from what the Kalan wanted, which looked different from what the Ven wanted, which looked different from what the humans wanted, and the humans themselves were not unified. Some wanted reparations invested entirely in Earth's ecological restoration. Others argued the funds should go to the off-world human communities that had been stranded for generations and had built entirely new cultures, in conditions the original Threadline founders could never have imagined. Usha's granddaughter, the Keykeeper, who had led the Coalition through the war, was not a diplomat. She said so plainly in the Long Thread Council's first formal session. "I am a cryptographer and an operations planner," she said. "I can tell you how to open a door. I cannot always tell you what should be on the other side. For that, we need something new." What they built was not a government in any traditional sense. It was a framework, a set of principles and processes that no single species controlled, that could not be overridden by any majority, that did not include representation from every tier of Coalition membership. And that built in, by design, the requirement to revisit and revise its own rules every 20 years. The Keykeeper called it a living structure, a system designed not to last forever unchanged, but to grow as the species within it grew. It was, in many ways, the most human thing the Coalition ever built. Not because humans designed it alone, but because it embodied the philosophy that had kept the Threadline alive for nearly 3 centuries. Nothing is permanent. Everything can be improved. Keep building. Year 341. The Vreth Empire had not disappeared. It had contracted, reformed, and was in the slow, painful process of becoming something different. The administrative dissident faction, which had grown to genuine political dominance in the 15 years following the Accord, was trying to do something their species had never done in recorded history, governed by consent rather than conquest. It was, by any honest assessment, going badly. Not because the reformers were insincere, but because they were trying to dismantle a system of thinking, a fundamental cultural assumption that had been built over thousands of years, and replace it with something the Vreth had no cultural vocabulary for. The reformers asked the Longthread Council for help. Specifically, they asked for teachers, not military advisors, not administrative consultants. Teachers, people from the coalition species who would come to Vreth worlds and help build educational programs that taught a different kind of history. The council debated for months. Bedorak said no, absolutely not. We owe them nothing after what they did to us. The Kalan were divided. The humans argued, and this was the argument that eventually carried the vote, that the alternative to helping the Vreth reform was a Vreth empire that failed to reform. And a failed Vreth reform did not mean a weakened threat. It meant a threat that had been humiliated, stripped of its empire, left with its worst instincts intact, and given a generation to nurse its grievances. That is not a neighbor anyone in this galaxy wants to have, said the human delegate. We did not fight for 289 years to create the conditions for the next war. We fought to make the next war unnecessary. The measure passed. The first coalition teachers arrived on Vreth worlds in year 343. It was, by all accounts, the strangest thing anyone in the galaxy had ever witnessed. Adorak Eldar, whose grandparents had survived the Vreth campaign that nearly destroyed their species, standing in front of a classroom of young Vreth and teaching history. Not Vreth history, galactic history. The full account, every species, every conquest, every piece of what the Empire had done and what it had cost. She did not shout. She did not perform grief or anger. She simply told the truth in the same patient, precise way that the Dorak had recorded it for 200 years. And the young Vreth, who had been taught a version of history in which their empire was a civilizing force, a necessary structure that brought order to chaos, sat in silence and heard something different. Some of them rejected it, some of them walked out, but some of them stayed, and those who stayed asked questions, and questions, once they start, are very hard to stop. Like and subscribe if you believe that truth told patiently is one of the most powerful forces in any universe. Share this because the next section is what it all was building toward. Yeah, 390. A Vreth student who had been in one of those first classrooms, who had stayed, who had asked questions, who had spent 50 years working in the reformist movement, was elected to lead the Vreth governing council. Her name was Vith. She was the first Vreth leader in the species. Recorded history to travel to a non-Vreth world, not as a conqueror or an administrator, but as a guest. She came to Earth. She stood in what had been Zone 7. She stood where Yusuf Adebayo had first tapped 23 characters into a hidden communications channel 400 years ago. There was a monument there now. Simple, stone, human-made, with a single inscription. The thread began here. Vetzarel stood at that monument for a long time. Then she placed her hand on it. It was a Vreth gesture of formal acknowledgement, the kind made to something that deserved to be recognized. She had prepared a speech. She did not give it. She said only this, in halting but practiced human language. I cannot give back what was taken. No words do that. I can only promise what I give forward, and I give forward every day of my leadership to making sure my species is never again the thing that built this monument. It was not enough. It could never be enough, but it was real. And after 400 years of operating in shadows, building in darkness, fighting in ways the enemy could not see, the coalition had learned to recognize and value real things, however imperfect, above grand gestures that meant nothing. Year 411. The ecological restoration of Earth passed a milestone. For the first time since the occupation began, the oceanic chemistry in the Pacific Basin had returned to preoccupation baseline. The industrial organisms were gone. The native ecosystem, supported by 2 generations of intensive joint human and Kalan, environmental science, was returning. It was not the Earth of 2031. It was something that had grown through trauma and emerged, different, but alive. The forests in the zone that had been Zone 7 were new forests, different species compositions than before. Faster-growing varieties selected for restoration rather than the slow climax ecosystems of the original. But forests. Green and breathing and full of sound. Sira Adebayo, then in her 70s, walked through those forests with her granddaughter. She did not speak much. She did not need to. She had spent her career writing the words. Here, she just walked. Her granddaughter, who was 12, asked her a question that 12-year-olds ask in the way that 12-year-olds do, with complete seriousness and no awareness of how deep the question was. She asked, "Was it worth it? All of it. All the years, all the people who didn't get to see this. Was it worth it?" Sira stopped walking. She thought for a long time. Tensei Saeed, I think worth it is the wrong question. It implies there was a calculation, a trade, some amount of suffering that could be weighed against some amount of outcome. The people who built the thread line didn't make that calculation. They didn't know this forest would exist. They didn't know any of this would exist. They built because they refused to disappear, not because they knew they would win, because they refused to stop. That's not a calculation. That's just who we are. Her granddaughter thought about this for a while as they walked. Tense aside, I think that's worth it. Sira smiled. Yes, she said. I think so too. Like this video if that conversation hit you somewhere deep. Subscribe to this channel because this community is built of exactly the kind of people this story is about. Share it, please, because this story deserves to reach everyone. Year 447. The Longthread Council convened its centennial review. Every 20 years, per the original framework, the Council reviewed and revised its own structures. The Centennial Review was the 5th such revision, and it produced the most significant structural change since the Accord itself. The Vreth, after 150 years of reform, after 3 generations of the dissident faction's governance, after Vesseral's successors had continued her work through the kind of slow, unglamorous, daily practice of better values that is harder than any war, formally applied for membership in the Longthread Council. Not as a conquered species, not as a reformed empire under supervision. As a member, equal in voice to every other species at the table. The debate lasted 2 years. It was the hardest conversation the Coalition had ever had. Harder in some ways than the decision to go to war, because war had a clear enemy. This had only complexity. The Doric bloc walked out of the council chamber on 4 separate occasions. Twice, it seemed the Coalition would fracture over the question. But both times, something held. The same thing that had held it together for nearly 5 centuries. The shared memory of what they had been through. The trust that had been built in darkness and tested in fire and maintained across generations who had never known each other personally but who had inherited a culture of mutual respect so deep it had become instinct. On the second walkout, a young Dirac delegate, no older than 20 by human reckoning, stood up in the empty chamber after her elders had left and spoke to the remaining delegates. "I know what was done to my people," she said. "I carry it. Every Dirac carries it. We will carry it forever. But I also know what my people chose to do with that history. We chose to record it precisely, completely, without distortion, so that no one could ever deny it or forget it. We chose truth as our weapon. And now the Vreth are asking to sit at our table. If I refuse them that seat, I am not honoring my ancestors' choice. I am abandoning it. My ancestors chose to make the truth undeniable. I will not make the truth irrelevant by refusing to let it do its work." The Doric delegation returned. The vote was taken. The Vreth joined the Longthread Council. Not unanimously, not without pain. But they joined, and in the species' ancient gesture of formal acknowledgement, Vesseral's successor placed both hands on the table of the Longthread Council and said the Vreth words that translate, roughly, as, "I am responsible for what stands before me." Year 470. Full circle. The centennial of the Longthread Wars, and the quadricentennial of the occupation's beginning. Earth was alive again. The Coalition species were free, growing, building lives that their ancestors had dreamed of from the inside of labor classifications. The Vreth Empire was gone, replaced by something still imperfect, still complicated, still working through centuries of inherited wrong, but genuinely trying in a way that even its harshest critics acknowledged was real. And on this day, in the Longthread Memorial in Zone 7, Sira Adebayo gave her final public speech. She stood in the forest her grandmother had helped grow. She stood where the stone, said the thread began here. She spoke to an audience of every species in the coalition, gathered in person and through the Venn Relay network, which now reached further than anyone in Year 1 could have imagined. She said, 470 years ago, a man named Yusuf Adebayo sat in the dark beneath a world that had been taken from us. He was not a general. He was not a king. He was a mining engineer with calluses on his hands and a mind that refused to go quiet. He tapped 23 characters into a hidden channel and waited to see if anyone was listening. And the lesson of the 470 years since then is not that we won. The lesson is what we were willing to be for 470 years, while winning was still uncertain. We were patient. We were small and patient, and impossible to kill because we were too distributed to cut out. We were honest with each other when honesty cost everything. We trusted beings who did not look like us, did not think like us, did not grieve like us, because we recognized in them the same refusal to disappear that lived in us. We made fire in the dark, and we shared it without asking what we would get in return. And when the war came and we won and the hard work of peace came after, we did not stop. We kept building. We kept choosing the harder thing when the harder thing was right. We let in the people who had hurt us, when they had truly changed, because we understood that a peace built on permanent exclusion is just a war that has not started yet. We are none of us the same species we were in 2031. Not humans, not Kalen, not Torak, not Ven, not even Vreth. We are all something that grew from that long darkness, something the darkness made. And what the darkness made, when we chose to make fire instead of simply endure, is this: a council of 32 species. A galaxy that has not had a war in 173 years. Forests growing where there were processing centers. Children who have never known a labor classification and do not understand why anyone ever thought that was acceptable. A universe that is slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly getting better. Yusuf asked if anyone was listening. We are the answer. Every life lived in freedom on every world this coalition touches is the answer. Every child who asks why things were the way they were and cannot understand it is the answer. Every moment a Vreth teacher stands in front of a class and tells the full truth of history is the answer. The thread did not end. It became the fabric. And the fabric holds. It holds because we built it to hold. Not for us. For them. For the children in that classroom who don't know what a labor classification is. For the forests growing in Zone 7. For every species not yet found in the dark of space who will one day reach out and hear, coming back to them across the stars. 23 characters in the light. We are. We've always been here. And the thread holds. If this story reached you, if it reminded you of something important about what we are capable of, please like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel and become part of this community. Share this with everyone you know, because stories like this are how we remember who we choose to be. This has been the full story of the Longthread Coalition. 470 years. 32 species. One thread that refused to break. We will not stop. Not while a single thread remains. Not while a single voice can speak in the dark. The thread holds. It always. As.